"That thing's useless past 10 feet, the young rangemaster said, loud enough for the whole firing line to hear. "That's a purse gun, sir, not a shooter's gun." The old man in the faded flannel jacket didn't answer. He just stood at lane 7 with a 2-inch Snub-Nose Smith & Wesson in his weathered hands, 6.38 wad cutters already loaded in the cylinder, and something quiet in his eyes that nobody in that building knew how to read. He closed the cylinder with a soft click. He picked up his target pack, and instead of walking to the 7-yard line like the rangemaster expected, he walked past it. Past 10, all the way to 15 yards. If you believe some men earn the right to carry whatever weapon they choose, comment the word respect below before we continue this story. His name was Earl Whitaker, and he was 78 years old, and for the first time in 4 months he had driven to a shooting range by himself. The little 2-bedroom house in Stafford, Virginia had been too quiet since Margaret died. The kind of quiet where you could hear the refrigerator click on in the kitchen, and the mail slot open at the front door, and the clock in the hallway marking off hours that didn't seem to lead anywhere anymore. Margaret had been his wife for 51 years. She had buried her parents and raised 2 daughters and packed his suitcase every time the bureau sent him somewhere he wasn't allowed to talk about, and she had died on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd bedroom with his hand in both of hers and a small dry smile on her face like she was apologizing for going first. Today was her birthday. She would have been 76. Earl had gotten up before dawn, made coffee in the old percolator she had always used, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at a card he could not send. Then he had gone to the closet and taken down the small leather range bag that had lived on the top shelf for 19 years, and inside that bag, wrapped in a soft flannel square Margaret had sewn for him the year they moved to Virginia, was the Snub-Nose, 2-inch barrel, blued steel worn smooth along the edges from a lifetime of holster wear, smooth wood grips, checkered in a pattern that had almost faded back to grain. On the butt of the grip frame, where most people would never look, there was a tiny engraving, shallow and gentleman-sized, 3 lines of lettering that the young rangemaster would have needed to put his glasses on to read. But nobody at the range knew about that engraving yet, and nobody knew what was folded inside the flannel square next to the gun either, a photograph, decades old, creased along the edges, that Earl had not been able to leave at home that morning. Iron Sights Shooting Centre sat just off Route 1 in a long commercial strip, wedged between a tyre shop and a liquor store, and on Saturday mornings the parking lot filled up before the 10 o'clock opening. It had not always been called Iron Sights. For 19 years it had been called the Reeves Indoor Range, and before that it had been a lumber warehouse, and before that, back when Earl was still wearing a badge, it had been an empty field behind a dairy farm. The sign out front was new, black and orange, aggressive font, a stylized crosshair running through the R. Inside, the air smelled of burnt powder and floor cleaner and coffee from a pot that had been on since 6 a.m. The front counter ran along the left wall. A rack of rental firearms hung on a pegboard behind it, every one of them polymer-framed, striker-fired, black. On the right wall was a glass case full of ammunition and holsters, and above that a framed photograph of the ranger's staff lined up in matching tactical polos, most of them younger than 30, all of them squinting a little at the camera like they were posing for a recruiting poster. Earl set his leather bag down on the counter. The young man at the register looked up from his phone, gave him the half-second glance that younger clerks gave to older men in flannel, and slid a clipboard across. "Lane?" the clerk asked. "Any open one?" Earl said. His voice was soft and carried a Carolina lilt worn down by decades of living other places. The clerk assigned him lane 7 without looking at his ID twice. Earl signed the waiver with a hand that had 2 small tremors in it, one from age, one from something that had never quite gone away. He paid cash. He carried his bag past the glass window of the indoor range, through the soundproof double doors, and onto the firing line. Out in the parking lot, a silver pickup truck was just now pulling in, and the man climbing out of it was about to recognize something he had not seen in almost 20 years. The lane was clean. Earl liked that. The carpet had been replaced recently. The baffles overhead were free of the grey-black scoring that cheap rangers never scraped off, and the paper target hanger slid smoothly on its cable when he tested it with 2 fingers. He set his bag on the wooden shelf and unzipped it with the patience of a man who had unzipped 1,000 range bags and never been in a hurry. First, the ear protection, not the new electronic kind, the old slimline muffs with the blue band, foam replaced once a year because he liked the way they seated. Then the safety glasses. Then last, the flannel square. He unfolded it slowly. The photograph he left inside, face down, pressed between the cloth and the bag liner. The snub-nose he lifted out in both hands the way another man might lift a pocket watch his grandfather had left him. 2 lanes down on the left, a young shooter with a new AR pistol was punching holes in a torso target at 7 yards, brass bouncing off the divider in bright little arcs. 3 lanes to the right, a father was teaching a teenage girl to hold a full-size polymer 9mm, both of them flinching on the trigger. Earl did not look at them. He opened the cylinder of the Smith, checked that it was empty, closed it, dry-fired once into the backstop with the muzzle down, opened it again, and began to load. 1 round at a time, thumb and finger, the 6 cartridges standing in a small cardboard tray at his elbow. That was when the rangemaster walked by for the first time. Brent Kessler was 26 years old and had been rangemaster for 5 months, promoted from counterclerk because the previous man had quit after a fight over scheduling. He wore a black polo with his name embroidered above a little flag patch. He had been in the army once for about 18 months before a shoulder separation during training sent him home before deployment. He did not talk about that. He talked about shooting, and he talked about gear, and he walked the firing line every 15 minutes with his chest out, and most of the regulars had already figured out that he needed something in the world to feel in charge of. Brent saw the snub-nose in Earl's hands and stopped walking. He squinted. He leaned one forearm on the divider. "Sir," he said, too loud. "Sir, we're doing concealed carry practice today." Earl loaded the 5th round. "Just practice," he said quietly. Brent grinned the grin of a young man about to deliver a line he had been saving. "That's a cute little gun, sir. My grandma carried one like that in her pocketbook." Down the line, the young shooter with the AR pistol laughed a short, surprised laugh. The father with the teenage girl pretended not to hear, but Earl saw the daughter glance sideways at her dad with the exact expression of a child who had just learned something about a grown man. Brent kept going, because he had an audience now. "Just so you know, these lanes go out to 25 yards. That thing's useless past 10 feet, seriously. 2-inch barrel, that's short sight radius. You can practice if you want, but don't expect to be hitting anything past the 7-yard line. That's more of a belly gun, a purse gun, contact distance piece." Earl loaded the 6th round. He closed the cylinder with a soft, clean click that he had made 10,000 times in his life, in dark hallways and classroom demonstrations and on the back porch of a house he didn't own anymore. "Appreciate the advice," he said. Brent kept grinning because he thought that had been a win. "Hey, no charge. I'm just saying. Folks come in here with those old wheel guns, they get frustrated, they don't hit anything, they go home, they never shoot again. I'm trying to save you the gas money, sir." Earl turned his head, very slowly, and looked at Brent Kessler for the first time. The look did not last more than a second and a half. It was not a glare. It was not even unkind. It was the look of a man who had stood in front of a lot of loud, certain young wrong men in his life, and who had long ago stopped needing to correct any of them out loud. Brent would remember that look for a long time. But right now he didn't know what he was looking at, and so he didn't know what was about to happen. None of them did. The gun in Earl Whittaker's hands was not a purse gun, and the old man in the faded flannel jacket was not a beginner who had wandered into the wrong building. And in about 4 minutes Brent Kessler was going to learn both of those things in front of every person on the firing line. Earl turned back to the bench. He pressed his thumb toward the frame in an old reflex. No, there was no magazine release on this gun, there never had been, and that small automatic mistake of thought made him smile inside the flannel jacket without moving his face. He set the revolver down on the shelf, muzzle pointed downrange, cylinder closed, hammer down on a chamber that was ready. He let his hands rest flat on either side of the gun and looked at them. The left hand had a shake in the index and middle fingers that had been there since 1972, the first year he had come home from a place that nobody had sent him to officially. The right hand had a different kind of tremor, lower in the meat of the thumb, that only came out when he was tired. He closed both hands into fists and opened them again. 3 times. He had taught men and women all over the country to do exactly that before a string of fire. Breathe, close, open, settle. A memory moved through him, and he did not fight it. The Quantico indoor range in the fall of 1987. Rain on the metal roof. 22 new agents in their second week of firearms, all of them wearing FBI sweatshirts too clean to be comfortable yet. He had stood on a low wooden platform and held up a revolver, exactly like the one sitting on the bench in front of him right now, and said, loud enough for the back row to hear, Ladies and gentlemen, do not fall in love with barrel length. The gun does not shoot the target. You shoot the target. The gun only does what you allow it to do. Half the class had written that down. One of them, a thin-framed young man with sharp eyes and a stammer he had almost beaten, had looked up from his notebook and said quietly, "Yes, sir." That young man's name had been Clayton Reeves. Earl had not thought about Clay Reeves in probably 6 years. He opened his eyes. He picked up the Snub-Nose. He stepped back from the bench and began to walk downrange with his target pack in one hand, and a feeling in his chest that he had not been expecting when he woke up that morning. Brent Kessler was 3 lanes over now, explaining something with gestures to a couple who had just rented a pair of compact 9s. He saw Earl walking past the 7-yard line out of the corner of his eye, and his head snapped around. "Sir," he called. Earl did not stop. Brent held up one finger to the couple and strode down the firing line, stepping carefully over the yellow stripe. Sir, excuse me. Most shooters start closer. You're going to get frustrated at that distance with that weapon. I'm telling you this for your benefit." Earl had reached the 10-yard line. He kept walking. Brent's voice climbed half a tone. "Sir, that gun is not a 15-yard gun. I'm telling you. 2-inch barrel. You're going to waste your ammunition." Earl stopped at the 15-yard line. He turned the target pack in his hands and clipped it to the carrier with the kind of 4-motion efficiency that only came from doing a thing 10,000 times. Then he sent the carrier back downrange to its stop and stood there looking at the paper he had just clipped up. It was not a standard silhouette. It was a 5-inch black circle on a white background, with an inner X-ring about the size of a man's thumbprint and a small aiming dot in the exact centre. The kind of target they used to run at Quantico for qualification pistol team tryouts. The kind of target Earl had seen in his sleep for 32 years. He walked back to the bench without looking at Brent. He picked up the revolver, and for the first time since Margaret had died, he felt something that wasn't grief move through the centre of his chest. It was the old, quiet, narrow thing that used to come to him when he stepped to the line with the gun that had carried him through 2 wars, 3 championships, and a career he was not allowed to talk about in public. He had not come here today to prove anything to Brent Kessler. He had come here because it was Margaret's birthday, and she had loved this gun almost as much as she had loved him, and the last thing she had said to him before the morphine took her away for good was, "Take it out sometimes, Earl. Don't let it sit in the dark." The silver pickup truck in the parking lot belonged to Clayton Reeves. Clay was 62 years old now, retired for 3 years, and he owned Iron Sights Shooting Centre the way a man owns a thing he cannot stand to sell. Before the range, he had been a special agent in charge out of the Richmond field office. Before that, an assistant SAC in Phoenix. Before that, a street agent working bank robbery and fugitive recovery for 14 years. And before any of that, in the fall of 1987, he had been a skinny second-week trainee at the FBI Academy who could barely hit the black at 7 yards, who stuttered when the instructors asked him questions, and who had almost washed out of Hogan's Alley before a man in a rain-damp polo shirt had pulled him aside, handed him a 2-inch revolver and said, "Son, you are overthinking this. Let the gun do what the gun was built to do." Clay had carried that sentence in his chest through every arrest and every standoff he had ever been part of. Clay was not supposed to be at the range that Saturday. He had come to drop off a box of shop rags and pick up a receipt book from the back office, and he had parked at the side entrance because it was faster. He came in through the armourer's door, said hello to the counter clerk, and walked past the glass window that looked onto the indoor range. And then he stopped. He stopped because there was an old man standing at the 15-yard line, and the way that old man had his feet set, heels 3 inches apart, toes slightly open, weight rolled forward into the balls of his feet, left shoulder a hair ahead of the right, was a stance Clay had watched a man teach, in rain on a metal roof, 38 years before. Clay Reeves took 3 slow steps closer to the glass. The old man raised the little revolver. The left hand came up and cupped the right, thumbs forward, wrists locked. The head tilted the smallest fraction of an inch to find the sights, and Clay, standing behind the soundproof glass, said a name out loud that he had not said out loud since 1996. He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says the name of his father. Then he pushed open the range door and walked in. The shot broke clean. Earl did not jerk. He did not blink. The little revolver rose in recoil, maybe 4 inches, and settled back onto the target almost before the brass inside the cylinder had finished its work. He paused for the length of one breath. He fired again. Pause. Again. Pause. again. 6 rounds in maybe 11 seconds, each shot separated by that small deliberate space that only a man who'd been doing this for half a century could manage under fluorescent lights in a strange building on a Saturday morning. On the 3rd shot, Brent Kessler stopped walking down the line. On the 4th, he stopped talking. On the 5th, one of the shooters 2 lanes over lowered his own weapon and turned to watch. And on the 6th, the father teaching his teenage daughter reached over and pressed the electronic recall button on his own lane to bring his target in, because he had understood somewhere deep in his chest that he wanted his daughter to see what was about to come back down the cable at lane 7. Earl opened the cylinder. He tilted the muzzle up and the 6 empty cases dropped into his waiting palm. He set them on the bench in a neat small row, the primers all facing the same direction. He laid the revolver down, cylinder open, ejector rod pointing toward the back wall, and only then did he press the recall button with his left thumb. The paper target started its slow hum back up the cable toward him. Brent was staring at it. Clay, who had crossed half the distance from the range door now, was staring at it. The young shooter with the AR pistol was staring at it. The woman at lane 9, shooting a small competition .22, had lowered her pistol without even thinking about it, and the clerk from the counter, drawn by the sudden drop in the line's noise, had come to the glass window and was staring too. And what that paper was about to show every person on the firing line was not just going to embarrass Brent Kessler, it was going to end the first real job he had ever been proud of. The target reached the line with a soft click. Earl did not need to look at it. He knew what it said. But every other person on the range looked, and nobody spoke for a second and a half that felt longer than that. 6 holes. All of them inside the 5-inch black circle. 4 of them inside the thumbprint-sized X-ring. 2 of the 4 were touching. One of those 2 was actually overlapping the other so closely that the paper between them had torn, making a small ragged figure 8 exactly in the centre of the bullseye at 15 yards, with a 2-inch Snub-Nose revolver, firing by any definition a rangemaster would know how to use, past the distance at which that gun was supposed to be capable of useful work. The young shooter, 2 lanes down, said a very quiet word under his breath. The teenage girl across the line let out a single breath she had been holding. Clay Reeves had reached the divider of lane 7. He stood there without stepping across the yellow line. He looked at the target first for maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked at the old man's face, and he said, softly enough that Brent Kessler almost didn't hear it, "Special Agent Whitaker." Earl turned. He saw Clay. Something crossed his face that the firing line would later describe in 5 different ways. A softening, a grief, a flash of recognition. The kind of look a man gets when he has not heard a certain voice in too long. He said, "Clay?" The 2 men looked at each other across the divider of lane 7, and something passed between them that nobody else in the building had the history to read. Brent was standing 4 feet away with his mouth slightly open. He looked at Earl. He looked at Clay. He looked at the target. He looked at Clay again, because Clay was the owner of the range and his boss's boss, and because something in Clay's expression had just told him that he had made a mistake the size of his entire career. Clay Reeves turned toward the firing line. His voice carried, because on a range you learn early how to make your voice carry without shouting. "Folks," he said, "I want everyone to cease fire for a minute. Weapons down, benched, actions open, please. On a commercial range, when the owner tells you to cease fire, you cease fire." Down the line, 12 shooters set their pistols and carbines on their shelves with cleared actions, and 12 faces turned toward lane 7. Clay put his hand on the top of the lane divider. He looked at Earl first. He spoke to the room, but his eyes did not leave the old man. "The gentleman standing in lane 7 is Earl Whitaker. Earl taught the FBI Academy's basic firearms course at Quantico, Virginia, for 21 years. Before that, he ran the advanced handgun program for our hostage rescue teams. Before that, he was a Force Recon Marine in 1967 and 1968, with a unit I'm not going to name in this room. He has won the National Police Shooting Championships in the Revolver class 3 times, 78, 81 and 84, and the Snub-Nose speed event twice, including 1 year with a cylinder time that, last I checked about 18 months ago, has never been broken. The gun on the bench in front of him is a Smith & Wesson Model 36 that the Bureau presented to him at his retirement in 2005. On the butt of that grip there is an engraving that says, "To EW, 32 years, Quantico." That gun has put more bullets into the X-ring than most people on this line will fire in their lifetime. Clay paused. Nobody moved. And the man who just told him that gun was useless past 10 feet is my range master. He turned. He looked at Brent Kessler. Brent's face had gone the kind of white that skin goes when the blood has decided it needs to be somewhere else in a hurry. "Brent," Clay said very quietly. "My office, when we're done here." But he was not done there. Not yet. Because there was one more thing about Earl Whittaker that Clay had not said out loud. One more thing that even some of the older shooters on the line did not know. And when it came out in the next 3 minutes, the whole room would understand why the Rangemaster's apology was never going to be enough on its own. Brent Kessler opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sir," he said to Earl, and his voice cracked a little on the word. "Sir, I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." Earl looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the long, steady, patient look of a man who'd been looked at that same way himself by other men, a long time ago, in places neither of them would have talked about at a bar. "Son," he said, "you didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to remember that you don't know who anybody is. Not the old woman buying a box of 22s for her husband's birthday. Not the man in the flannel jacket who walks in alone on a Saturday. Nobody." The firing line was still silent. The father 3 lanes down had his hand on his teenage daughter's shoulder. The young shooter with the R pistol had taken his hat off, which he could not have explained if you asked him. A woman in her 40s, in khakis and a blue sweatshirt who had been shooting a competition 22 at lane 9, walked 2 steps closer to lane 7 and stopped, and Earl saw her eyes and understood that she was trying not to cry in front of everybody. Clay cleared his throat. "One more thing," he said. In August of 1989, Earl Whittaker was shot twice in an alley, behind a bank in Memphis, Tennessee, while protecting a bank manager and her 11-year-old son from an armed fugitive. He returned fire with the weapon that is sitting on the bench right now. 4 rounds, 2 hits, ended the threat, took the fugitive alive. For that incident, he received the FBI Medal of Valor. The bank manager's son grew up and became a United States Marine. His mother still sends Earl a Christmas card every year. Clay stopped. Earl was looking at the floor. "I'm telling you all this," Clay said, "because in a little while Earl is going to pack up his gun and go home, and most of you will probably never see him again, and I don't want a single person in this building thinking that what just happened on lane 7 was a trick or luck or a show. That gun and that man have been keeping their promises to people for 57 years. We owe it to ourselves not to forget what we just saw." The woman in the blue sweatshirt was crying now. She didn't bother to hide it. The teenage girl was holding her father's hand without looking at him. Brent Kessler was not moving at all. Earl did not say anything for a moment. He picked up his 6 spent cases from the bench. He dropped them one by one into the small brass jar he carried in his bag, the way he had dropped spent brass into tin coffee cans on a back porch 40 years ago. He wiped down the revolver with the same flannel square that Margaret had sewn. He did not fold the photograph back in with it this time. He left the photograph out, face up, on the shelf. It was a picture of 2 people on the porch of a small cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. A younger Earl with black hair and a quiet jawline, and a woman with a gentle, tired smile, both of them holding rifles, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Margaret had been a hell of a shot too. She had taught 3 of his academy classes once when he'd come down with bronchitis, and 2 of her students had written her thank you letters that Earl still had in a drawer at home. Brent Kessler was standing at the edge of the lane with his hands at his sides like a soldier waiting for an order. Earl zipped the bag closed most of the way. He looked at Brent. "You got a minute, son?" he said. Brent nodded. He did not trust his own voice. Earl took the photograph between 2 fingers very carefully and turned it around so Brent could see it. "This is my wife," he said. "Margaret. She passed 4 months ago. Today is her birthday. She'd have laughed at you today, by the way. She'd have laughed a lot. She had a mean streak in her for men who talked before they knew the room." He put the photograph away. "I'm telling you that because I want you to understand I'm not angry at you. I came here this morning to feel close to her, and you reminded me of about 11 of my own recruits over the years. Loud, confident, not quite listening. Every one of them turned out fine. You will too if you let this be the day you change." Brent's eyes were wet. He did not speak because there was nothing he could have said that would not have sounded small. Earl picked up the bag, but before he left the range he did one more thing, a small, almost invisible thing, that Clay Reeves would tell his wife about that night over dinner, and that the woman in the blue sweatshirt would tell her husband about in the car on the way home, and that the teenage girl 3 lanes down would tell her own daughter about 30 years later at a kitchen table in a town Earl Whittaker had never been to. He walked over to lane 9. The woman in the blue sweatshirt was still standing there, trying to look like she hadn't been crying. Earl stopped in front of her. He did not know her. She did not know him. "You had a nice group up there before all this," he said gently, nodding at her target, which she had forgotten to bring back. "You're pulling slightly left on your second string, probably squeezing with your whole hand instead of just the pad of the index. Easy fix. If you want, I'll show you sometime." She nodded because she could not speak. Earl smiled at her. It was the first real smile he had smiled at a stranger since November. Then he walked out. Clay walked him to the parking lot. At Earl's old sedan, a dark green 4-door that Margaret had picked out in 2011, the 2 men stood for a long time without talking. The sky was the pale blue colour of early spring in Virginia, and a robin was working a patch of grass at the edge of the lot, with the small dignified focus of a thing that had its own job to do. Finally Clay said, "I'm sorry about Margaret, I didn't know." "It's all right," Earl said. "You weren't supposed to. I didn't tell anybody." Clay looked down at his boots. "Mr. Whittaker," he said, and the old form of address came back to him as easily as muscle memory. "Would you come back here on Saturdays? Not to shoot, to teach. A class. Revolver fundamentals. Any group you want. I'll pay you what a class is worth. I'll pay you what it's actually worth, whichever makes you uncomfortable. Your call." Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Clay." "Yes, sir." "Put me down for 9 a.m. next Saturday. 6 students. And whoever that woman in the blue sweatshirt is, save her a seat." Clay said he would. Earl got in the sedan and drove home. That night, for the first time since Margaret had died, he slept more than 4 hours without waking up. The Saturday class filled in 11 days. By the end of the first month, there was a waiting list that ran into June. Brent Kessler was in every single one of those classes in the back, taking notes in a small black notebook he had bought specifically for that purpose. And halfway through the second month, Earl started asking him to help set up the targets, and halfway through the third month, Earl started calling him by his first name. A year later, on Margaret's birthday, Earl stood on the firing line at Ironsight's shooting centre, with 8 new students spread across 4 lanes. A spring morning. Light coming through the high windows at the front of the building, landing in long, bright bars on the carpet. The Snub-Nose was holstered on his right hip. The flannel square, folded, was in the shelf of lane 7, waiting for him, like it always waited for him now. On the wall near the door, Clay Reeves had hung a new photograph. It showed Earl at 15 yards, arms extended, little revolver in both hands, 6 rounds already downrange and 1 paper target already making its slow way home. Brent Kessler, who was now the assistant training director, had the photo framed himself at a small shop in Fredericksburg and paid for it out of his own pocket. Underneath, in small plain letters, a line Earl had once said at Quantico: "The gun does not shoot the target. You shoot the target. Do not fall in love with barrel length. Some men earn the right to carry whatever weapon they choose. Some truths cannot be measured by what a thing looks like on the outside, or how old the man holding it happens to be. If this story reminded you of a veteran in your own life, a father, a grandfather, a quiet old man in a flannel jacket who never told you everything he did, subscribe to this channel and share this story so their service is never forgotten. Comment respect for Earl Whittaker and honour for every one of them still standing at their own 15-yard line,